Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. As Dean of SIPA, it's my real privilege to welcome you to our program this evening, the George McGovern Lecture, featuring Professor Shlomo Ben-Ami. Professor Ben-Ami joins us this semester as the visiting McGovern Professor of International and Public Affairs, and we're really delighted to have him here with us. I'd like to also welcome our own provost, John Coatsworth, and his wife, Pat, who will be introducing more fully Professor Ben-Ami in a moment, and also a bit more about the impetus for this lecture, and in fact, the McGovern Professorship. But I just want to say that this evening, Professor Ben-Ami is going to address a subject of really enormous importance in the world, and one that we engage very deeply here at SIPA. And as you know, we've had for a long time a degree specialization in international conflict resolution, now headed by Professor Edward Luck, that provides our students with very broad and substantive education and training in understanding the roots and causes of international conflicts and how they might be resolved. And it includes the history of conflict, peacekeeping, negotiation, international enforcement, of course, the role of the United Nations, international norms, and a real mix of academic learning and hands-on exposure and theory to help prepare students for this very challenging field and careers. And I think we're very proud to have this concentration here in this period when we need to be training young professionals to take leadership roles in an increasingly dangerous world. Today, I think we're hearing from someone who draws deep, deep insights from leadership positions in a couple of important jurisdictions in the world. So it's really a unique privilege for us to have him here with us this semester, and I'd like to invite our provost, John Coatsworth, to say a few words and to more properly introduce Professor Ben-Ami.
Thank you, Meredith. It's always a pleasure to be back at SIPA and to see it under such capable leadership. You know, there was a dark period that preceded her. I just want to say that it's a special pleasure to be here for on the occasion of this lecture, and for a speaker like Professor Shlomo Ben-Ami, the 2006 George S. McGovern Visiting Professor. The McGovern Fund was established in 2013 by an anonymous donor. The endowment fund supports the appointment of a visiting fellow or professor whose life and work mirror George McGovern's commitment to public service, to social progress and educational opportunity, and to international peace and cooperation. Professor Ben-Ami is a scholar, educator, accomplished writer, former diplomat and member of the Knesset in Israel, a former cabinet minister and negotiator, and a steadfast champion of cooperation and peace, both in his home country of Israel and in other regions of the world. Professor Ben-Ami was born in Tangiers when the city was under Spanish control. After emigrating to Israel, he was educated at Tel Aviv University and earned his DPhil in Spanish history at St. Antony's College, Oxford. Returning to Israel, he joined the history department at Tel Aviv University, where he built a distinguished career with works on Spanish and later the Spanish history, and later the history of Israel and the Middle East. In 1987, Professor Ben-Ami was appointed Israel's ambassador to Spain, where he served until December 1991. In 1996, he entered politics as a Labour candidate for the Knesset and won a smashing victory. In 1999, he was appointed as Minister of Public Security, and in 2000 became Foreign Minister of Israel, where he led the peace talks with the Palestinians throughout the last 2 years of the Clinton administration, including the Camp David Summit. His latest book is entitled Scars of War, Wounds of Peace, The Israeli-Arab Tragedy, published by Oxford University Press. Professor Ben-Ami has also served and currently serves as a member of a number of international boards, including the International Crisis Group and the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. He is a special advisor to the United Nations Middle East Project and serves as vice president of the Toledo International Center for Peace, of which he is a co-founder. More recently, he has been serving as an advisor to the Colombian government on the peace process with the Armed Forces of Colombia. He is someone with deep knowledge of the nature of conflict and the means by which conflicts are sometimes able to achieve resolution, which is a subject of focus and inquiry and research here at SIPA by its students and by its faculty, as Dean Jano mentioned. This evening, he will share his views with us in a speech entitled "The Politics of Conflict, Remarks on the Middle East and Beyond." It is my honor to introduce him to you this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Shlomo Ben-Ami to give the 2016 George S. McGovern Lecture.
Well, I am most thankful for this generous introduction, and I am most obliged for this appointment. And I think I owe a few words of introduction with regard to the name of this chair, George McGovern. He was a war hero and a principal opponent of the Vietnam War. George McGovern, to me, is a pioneer among Western leaders to put on the global agenda humanity's challenge with hunger, scarcity, and food production. Internationally, is more known as an opponent of the war, but that was a major endeavor of George McGovern. These our days are days of mass migrations driven by war and an ecological panic linked to the rapid desertification of Africa and the Middle East. McGovern's food and agricultural agenda is today more relevant than ever. It is truly a privilege to be associated with the political and intellectual feature of this public servant. These are also days where the resistance to diplomatic solutions is common to most of the major conflicts. Vladimir Putin's revisionism has launched NATO into the biggest military buildup on Russia's borders since the Cold War. As elusive as an Arab-Israeli peace is the chance that the imploding broader Middle East would make peace with itself anytime soon. And in East Asia, a Thucydides trap, the notion that when a rising power, Athens then, China now, causes fear in an established power, Sparta then, America now, the escalation to war becomes possible. An updated version of the Thucydides trap is Sir Eyre Crow's famous 1907 memorandum, where he predicted that Germany's defiance of British naval hegemony was bound to lead to war, which it did in 1914. History suggests that diplomacy produces results only when backed by overwhelming power. Conflicts become ripe for diplomatic solutions only when the parties get trapped in painful mutual deadlocks, exactly the kind of deadlock created in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, without which an Israeli-Egyptian peace could not have happened. It was the first Gulf War and the Palestinian Intifada that created the conditions for the 1991 Madrid Peace Conference and the subsequent Oslo Accords. A friend of mine, Joaquin Villalobos, the guerrilla commander in El Salvador and now peacemaker in Colombia, instructed me that the FMLN in 1989 offensive showed the insurgents that they could not spark a popular uprising, so that not that the army could anymore protect the establishment. The offensive, he explained to me, codified the existence of a mutually hurting stalemate and made the conflict ripe for a solution. More than the diplomatic vocation of Europe, it was NATO's robust military intervention that created the conditions for the end of genocide and ethnic cleansing in the old Yugoslavia. Kosovo's drive for independence could not have materialized before Serbia was militarily humbled. Peace is hardly ever the naive attainment of non-coercive solutions. Treating power and diplomacy as distinct and separate phases of foreign policy, as President Clinton did in the abortive Camp David summit, and Secretary Kerry in his last failing attempt to resolve the Palestinian conflict, denies the mediator conviction power. This is also the case of struggles for self-determination. States were always born amid dramas of blood and self-sacrifice. President Abbas' current strategy of getting a Palestinian state through the goodwill of the international community is, I am afraid, flawed. Sadly, Israeli occupation would not end before yet more bloody upheavals shake the complacency of all. The ripening of a conflict for a shift to a diplomatic phase requires also that the mediator transforms into a manipulator and an arm twister. Indeed, America's only successful attempts at peacemaking in the Middle East involved coercive diplomacy, a combination of power, manipulation, and pressure. Henry Kissinger used it to lead Israel to a groundbreaking interim settlement with Egypt and Syria following the 1973 war. President Jimmy Carter, blind and deaf to pressure groups and lobbies on the Hill, used it to conclude in 1978 an Egyptian-Israeli peace. In 1991, an American president and the resolute Secretary of State, George Bush and James Baker, excelled in the use of American power for diplomatic purposes. They turned their extraordinary capacity of coalition building in the first Gulf War as a leverage to launch the Arab-Israeli peace process in the Madrid Peace Conference, October 91. Jews and Arabs are not alone in being incapable of reaching out to each other unless pushed by superior global forces and major regional upheavals beyond their control. The Esquipulas peace accords in Central America, about which the provost knows a lot, were reached amidst major regional upheavals. And the end of civil war in Salvador and Guatemala in the mid-90s, just as the beginning of the Arab-Israeli peace process, was linked to the eclipse of the Soviet Union, which ended up denying military and ideological oxygen to Moscow's state and non-state satellites. Nor is peace today in Colombia unrelated to the diplomatic shift of the region that denied the guerrillas the ideological and logistic support of the so-called Bolivarian Axis. Arguably, however, the coercive brand of diplomacy, as it was applied in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War or in Bosnia, belongs to the conditions of the old battlefield. The era of glorious victories is over. The linear Clausewitzian convention of military action facilitating a political solution is no longer relevant to the asymmetric wars of today. America's 3-week shock and awe campaign ended in victory with the toppling of Saddam Hussein, but opened the gates of hell to the forces of the occupation for more than a decade and left them without a valid interlocutor to make peace with. Now, more than ever in history, the use of power needs to be tempered by reasonable compromises. Negotiating with the Taliban in Afghanistan and Hamas in Palestine makes more sense than fighting unwinnable wars where even a military deadlock is no longer conducive to negotiations. Frequently, governments in democratic societies had to be coaxed into assuming the inevitability of compromise thanks to the pressure from below. Civil society's mobilization for bridging the psychological gap between Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland helped pave the way to peace. And Israel's withdrawal in May 2000 from Lebanon, after 18 years of military occupation, was made in great part under the impact that the Four Mothers movement had on the government. Colombia's peace has recently highlighted also the controversial relationship between peace and justice. The Nuremberg trials provide an ideal model for post-conflict justice. But in cases where no side has been defeated, a trade-off between reconciliation and accountability may well be inescapable. The fundamentalist notion of the ICC, of the International Court, of the International Criminal Court, that in the transition from war to peace, the rule of law replaces politics is utterly unrealistic. Rhetoric apart, Palestinian negotiators know that justice to the plight of Palestine would not be based on return, but on reparation, moral compensation. But then Colombians have the advantage of a conflict free of religious and ethnic components. Israelis and Palestinians are trapped in a prison of memory and ethnic, religious, unmovable constraints. It is the total and absolute nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has made it into such a desperately protracted dispute. It is not just a collision over territory or a banal border dispute. It is a clash of rights and memory, the longing for the same landscapes, the mutually exclusive claims of ownership of land and religious sites, and symbols, and the ethos of dispossession. This is what makes the national narratives so irreconcilable. A mirror image of each other, Israelis and Palestinians compete for the monopoly on the ethos of victimhood, exile, Holocaust, and return. Allies and rivals alike are frequently at a loss trying to understand the logic of Israel's defiance of the international community's sensibilities with regard to the Palestinian question. Historically, Jewish experience in international relations was not particularly edifying. An independent Jewish state existed for only short periods out of our millenarian history, and it twice committed political suicide. The reason was always the same: the blunder of ignoring political realities, the drift into messianic fanaticism, and the defiance of world powers. Ethnocentrism tends to distort a people's relations with the rest of the world. The tendency today of the Israeli nationalistic right of facing the world, an amorphous and almost meta-historical figure with whom the Jews have a dispute pending that cannot be resolved through the traditional tools of international relations, this tendency was reasserted through the role of the Holocaust as the constituent myth of the Zionist Israelist meta-narrative. Israel's ideology of power was drawn from the depth of Jewish experience and from the supposedly eternal, unforgivable hostility of a Gentile world. Nor is Israel's complex, multifaceted social structure easily conducive to an accommodation with either the Palestinians or the international community. An exciting brand of Tel Aviv Israeliness, secular, democratic, high-tech oriented, has been politically overpowered by a Jerusalemite Israel. Embedded in the dire lessons of Jewish history, it is a magnet for the fears and complexes of a wide rainbow alignment of ethnic minorities yearning for Jewish roots. This Jerusalemite Israel is the epitome of a deep-rooted fear of the Arabs and an unyielding distrust of the Gentiles, of the international community. Jerusalem's ethnocentrism is compounded by the fact that while peace with the Arab world is a strictly political undertaking based on the restitution of territory, a fairly straightforward matter of real estate, peacemaking with the Palestinians is in contrast an attempt to almost break the genetic code of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and perhaps even of the Jewish-Muslim dispute, by touching upon millenarian religious certificates of ownership. Arafat's failure to bring peace to his people had much to do with his intrinsic resistance to being the first and the only Arab leader to recognize the unique historical bonds of the Jews to their millenarian homeland and holy shrines. An unnecessary travesty of history, or perhaps political stupidity, now seconded by UNESCO. The Palestinian constituent ethos of the right of return and Islamic values, more than land and real estate, were the insurmountable obstacles that prevented an agreement at Camp David and later in Taba. But an Israeli leader has yet to emerge to take responsibility for the Palestinian tragedy of dispossession and exile. There is an unexpected irony in the fact that the Israeli Jews, who owe their existence as a nation to their extraordinary memory of past history, should now rely on the Palestinians for getting theirs. But it is not only the Israeli-Palestinian dispute that needs to develop a new lingua franca for addressing conflicts that puts human givens at the center. The international order, as well as democratic politics, where fear now joins anger to overwhelm reason, grow ever more unpredictable because of a missing piece in the equation, innate human needs. This is not adeptly taken into consideration by negotiators. This is an era of rising mass emotions, fear and humiliation of vast communities and all civilizations. People operate at a basic level of anxiety and false nostalgia behind the complexities of politics, and politicians do not detect that too automatically. Ignoring the givens of human nature is what has made the Israeli-Palestinian dispute into such a desperately protracted conflict. It will never be resolved until there is a genuine acceptance by all parties that peace depends upon the innate needs for security, autonomy, dignity, the acknowledgement of wrongs and reparation, moral no less than material, being met for both communities. As he also does with the Palestinians, Netanyahu pushed for an unrealistic Iran deal based on humiliation and total surrender by Tehran. Seen from the prism of human needs, dignity, Iran's status as an old civilization and a regional power with advanced scientific qualities, the Iran negotiations showed how addressing needs can increase the chances of peace diplomacy. Particularly revealing was the advice of an Egyptian author during the peace negotiations with Israel. If instead of obsessively spying on our military movements, you would have read more of our poetry and literary narrative, you might have known better what were our deeper feelings and might have saved our countries the tragedy of the 1973 war. I also think of Atticus in Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, teaching the same lesson. You never really understand a person until you climb into his skin and walk around it, he advised his daughter. Nor does the security response address the causes behind the rise of Islamist extremism. Young people are being drawn to jihadism out of fundamental emotional needs, sense of status, connection to a wider community, and the pursuit of greater meaning as expressed through the embrace of religious missions. Globalization is not making things easier. One of its effects is for groups to adhere to their traditional identities as a response to a monolithic global culture. Nowhere is this more the case today than in the Middle East, where group identity is simultaneously the instrument of survival, of conflict, and eventually of destruction. Leadership, of course, matters. It was politically far more rewarding for President Santos in Colombia to pursue the war against FARC, against the guerrilla, instead of engaging in a divisive and uncertain peace process. Too seldom does the world see history-changing steps like de Gaulle's peace in Algeria, Richard Nixon's trip to China, or Egyptian President Sadat's visit to Jerusalem. Peace came to South Africa when the charismatic generosity of Nelson Mandela met the understanding of de Klerk that the most conservative solution for the white minority was a revolutionary one. Peace was also made possible when terrorists and warlords, Jomo Kenyatta, Menachem Begin, Martin McGuinness, exhausted the utility of war and opted to become statesmen. Most of these peacemakers excelled in the art of political betrayal as the key to the resolution of a conflict. In politics, it is necessary either to betray one's country or the electorate. I prefer to betray the electorate, explained de Gaulle when he gave up Algeria. King Abdullah I of Jordan, Anwar Sadat, and Yitzhak Rabin paid with their lives for such a betrayal. Nor could have Ariel Sharon performed the single most important move against Israel's settlement obsession, the dismantling of the entire Israeli colonial presence in Gaza, without betraying his electorate, and indeed his own political biography. The technique of the negotiations is no banal matter, of course. The Israeli-Palestinian peace process is a monument to the utter inadequacy of Kissinger's technique of constructive ambiguity. Constructive ambiguity facilitated an agreement in Oslo at the price of creating irreconcilable misconceptions with regard to the final settlement. Ambiguous, full of lacunae, and essentially built on the unequal relations between the occupied and the occupier, the Oslo Accords contained the seeds of their own destruction. And, nevertheless, they received a Nobel Peace Prize. Instead of making peace, you always look more as if you are getting ready for the next war. This complaint was made to me by a future Palestinian prime minister who was my interlocutor in the meetings in the summer residence of Sweden's prime minister. This complaint was not entirely baseless, and the reason is twofold. The pernicious effects of Israeli occupation on the Palestinians have, of course, much to account for, but the current institutional disarray in Palestine cannot be exclusively blamed on the occupation. State building was never the main motive of a movement split between pan-Islamist dreamers of a borderless Arab nation, secular nationalists. Secondly, peace, just like war, has always been a militarized affair in Israel. You might recall President Dwight Eisenhower's warning in 1961 of the rise of what he then called a military-industrial complex that might one day take control of the nation's foreign and defense policy. That America has since then drifted from one war to another might not be entirely unrelated to Eisenhower's prophecy. The Israeli debate over the future of the occupied territories is likewise overwhelmingly influenced by an all-encompassing security network that injects a military and security rationale into policy making. The securitization of the peace process has had throughout a major role in relegating the potential civilian consequences of peace into a marginal consideration. Third-party involvement in peacemaking is frequently a vital necessity, but this requires that the guarantor respects his commitments with the peacemakers. A defining moment in Israel's loss of trust in the international community's mediating role happened in 1967. UN Secretary General U Thant and world powers paved the way to war by ignoring their own guarantees for the freedom of navigation in the strategic Straits of Tiran. Menachem Begin later ridiculed the pretensions of the international community to be a peace broker. I have no problem with guarantees, he said, but what I need are guarantees to guarantee the guarantees. Or take the case of Ukraine. In the 1994 Budapest Protocol, she agreed to waive her nuclear capabilities in exchange for international guarantees to her territorial integrity. Possibly Crimea might have still be hers, and Putin might have already ceased the harassment of eastern Ukraine if Kiev would have kept her nuclear arsenal. Foreign policy, particularly in a conflict environment, starts at home. Utterly dysfunctional, Israel's political system is more an obstacle than a vehicle for conflict resolution. Prime Minister Netanyahu likes to present external threats to Israel's existence as the reason for his reluctance to make the necessary concessions for peace with the Palestinians. But the real threat to Israel is internal. An ethno-religious regime that edges towards a South African reality is the end of Israel as it was conceived by the founding fathers. Nations in history hardly ever get assassinated. They commit suicide. Would the Babylonians and later the Romans have destroyed Jewish independence if it were not for the fanatically messianic trends among the Hebrews and their utterly unrealistic defiance of superpowers, all recurrent trends these days? The Roman Empire itself would not have succumbed under the pressure of the Germanic tribes if it were not for its internal decay. The real existential threat facing Israel is not nuclear Iran. Rather, it is to be found in the morally corrosive effects of the occupation of the Palestinian people. War unites nations. It is the search for peace that divides them. The leader in quest for peace will too often have a split nation and a divided polity threatening to derail his entire peace enterprise. Too frequently, peace processes are defeated by politics, not necessarily by the core issues in the negotiating table. Colombia is these days a sad case in point. But domestic concerns are not exclusive to democracies. The Israeli-Syrian peace negotiations at the start of the millennium collapsed for what Sigmund Freud defined as the narcissism of minor differences, the same kind of ethnic narcissism that broke into pieces the old Yugoslavia. But of course, the few square meters on the eastern shores of the Lake of Galilee that prevented an agreement are only the expression of the powerful impact of national pride on foreign policy. Authoritarian leaders believe they are more capable to survive a military defeat than the generosity of the peacemaker. Today, Syria has become the motherland of pain. A peace deal with Israel would have opened the gates of Damascus to an American alliance and changed for the better the course of Syria's history. But autocracies tend to have an existential problem with peace agreements that might end up unleashing processes of domestic political change. Hence, Iran would insist that the nuclear agreement is by no means the beginning of a broader understanding with America. she aspires to be an opposed pole to America's designs for the region. The end of orchestrated shouts of death to America would also be the end of the Islamic Revolution. Israel's insistence on full normalization, free trade, joint economic projects, mass tourism looked to Syrians and Egyptians as an exercise in regime change. The resolution of an international conflict is not about making love. It is about making peace. Reconciliation can wait for another generation. Even if in democracy, economic considerations prove to be secondary to nationalist sentiments. Ask the Brexiters, or go to John Maynard Keynes, who failed to convince the leaders of Europe in his 1919 booklet, The Economic Consequences of Peace, that vindictive patriotism was a bad advisor for an era of peace, and that they needed to open wide spaces of economic cooperation with Germany instead of humiliating her. They would understand that only after yet another world war. The current Middle East mayhem is only partly due to America's oscillation between two destabilizing approaches. First, it was George W. Bush's constructive instability. He eventually left us only at the instability stage. And then Obama's vacillation between withdrawal and timid engagement. Yet the crisis in the lens of Islam is a civilizational, fundamentally homegrown conflict that has no military solution. The lesson from Iraq and from Israel's war with Hamas and Hezbollah is that forging international and regional alliances around the legitimate objective is more adequate these days than sheer military capacity for tackling complex religious and cultural conflicts. After a long, inconclusive war in Afghanistan, Washington finally accepts that negotiating with the Taliban is no anathema. Engaging political Islam needs to be a central component in a new reform and peace strategy in the Middle East. The challenge is not how to destroy Islamist movements, but how to turn them away from revolutionary politics by allowing them a legitimate political space. The tense equation between the Arab incumbent regimes and political Islam cannot be a zero-sum game, as President Assisi pretends. Taking religion off the public square is a Western liberal model that cannot work in the Arab world. Theirs is the formidably historic task of building a modern state for a devout people. But categorical perspectives are inadequate for the understanding of the complex fabric of Islamist groups. They are essentially social movements with a wide community network whose world of religious imagery has always been located within a political context. Political Islam is one thing, global jihadism is another. Eradicating the mother of all jihadists, ISIS, is of course a noble mission. Yet it is conducted these days within a tension between values and highly uncertain strategic benefits. ISIS thrives among Sunni communities intimidated by Iran and its Shiite proxies. The symptom rather than the cause. ISIS' rapid expansion was the result rather than the cause of the meltdown of the artificial Arab states. Yes, it employs obscene tactics, but so do many other groups in the Levant and Mesopotamia, including some of America's allies in the war against ISIS. Only that, unlike al-Baghdadi's army of adventurers and psychopaths, they do not exalt their monstrosities on social media. The only true antidote to ISIS are strong and solid Arab states. The edges of ISIS' potential growth are functional Sunni states with a firm national identity, like Turkey, and solid nation states like Iran and Israel. Should ISIS try to expand to Jordan, it would meet an orderly state whose survival is a primordial Israeli concern. But the indigenous groups operating far away from the caliphate's borders in Sinai and North Africa neither owe their existence to Baghdadi, nor would they disappear if ISIS core is defeated. Even then, the socio-political ecosystem from which ISIS derives its existence would endure, thereby maintaining the conditions for the re-emergence of other equally flamboyant groups. State building has been a recurrent failure in the Middle East, and even if ISIS is overpowered, no real nation states would emerge. Sunni Arab warlords would constitute part of the landscape for a long time. The challenge posed by the Russia-Iran-Hezbollah axis is more robust than that of ISIS, and its objectives, a resurrected Syria and Iraq as unfriendly nations to the West, are attainable. As unappealing as it may be, ISIS is a piece of the puzzle that counterbalances Moscow's led axis. Unless a grand global Euro-Atlantic bargain is reached with Russia on issues beyond Syria, it is unclear from a strategic point of view why the US should interrupt ISIS in its counterbalancing pursuits. A revised US strategy could cut Washington's dependency on Russia in Syria and disarm Moscow from the Syrian card it holds for its more important strategic game in Crimea, Ukraine, and Europe. ISIS might be defeated or not, but the US is bound to betray its most efficient allies in this war, the Kurdish Peshmergas. Washington's strategic trap is such that compensating the Kurds with their longed-for statehood would be torpedoed by all of America's reluctant allies and enemies, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. A Wilsonian post-war scenario, this is certainly not going to be. The world would, of course, be a better place if powers, small and big alike, would supersede their penchant for unilateral actions. Multilateralism was definitely vital in solving conflicts, such as that of the Balkans. A growing multilateral consensus was also responsible for the P5+1 negotiations on Iran's nuclear program and the climate change deal reached in Paris. However, in those conflict theaters where nothing less than world peace is at stake, such as the Middle East and East Asia, actors are either going their own way or are incapable of devising convincing multilateral solutions. Stymied by domestic constraints, Washington has become an utterly ineffective broker in the Palestine process. It would do well to relinquish its monopoly over it. A multilateral enterprise along the 5P+1 with Iran would definitely be more effective. There is nothing more dangerous in international relations than a strong power that is also insecure. Israel's penchant for overreaction on security matters and Iran's nuclear adventure and anti-status quo strategy are the cases of two encircled and isolated powers whose regional behavior stems from a genuine sense of existential vulnerability. Military build-up in East Asia is compounded by a real war closer to Europe. To Vladimir Putin, the 1945 Yalta Agreement did not die. Its borders simply moved eastward. The problem with Ukraine is as old as international relations. She is weak. Putin is no Hitler, but he shares with him two ominous traits. One is his tendency to push to its limits the inherent laxity of democracies to fight back. Another is the ambition to create territorial contiguities with some of Russia's minorities beyond its borders. But then, since when in history did empires go quietly? Until very recently, the largest land empire in history, Russia cannot be an exception to the rule. Portraying Putin as the movie's bad guy would solve nothing, however. Of all people, it was George Kennan, the man who defined America's Cold War strategy, who also warned against NATO's enlargement. Instead of expanding the hostile military alliance into Russia's borders, what was required was to devise ways for engaging Russia and respecting her legitimate security concerns and her sense of status. It is not Syria, but Ukraine that holds the key to an understanding with Moscow. The February 2015 Minsk Protocol, the centralization project for Ukraine, a key demand of Moscow, is still a dead letter. Europe, a patient in an iron lung, as Arthur Koestler defined her already 70 years ago, is now going through another momentous existential crisis, and it is truly pathetic to think that her embrace of Ukraine as a potential member, an idea fiercely opposed by Putin, could be the solution to Kiev's colossal financial problems. This is not about resuscitating the Soviet Empire. It is about reordering its dangerously chaotic dismemberment and ultimately engaging Russia in a benign cooperation with the West, while strictly putting limits to Russian revisionism. Russia has a right to feel free from NATO's presence in her immediate near abroad, provided she acknowledges the territorial integrity of her neighbors. Sanctions are not going to bring Russia to its knees. Her vast geography, nuclear capabilities, and immense cultural baggage make it a power to be reckoned with. A global superpower she is not, but a highly dangerous global spoiler she certainly can be. No modern autocrat can survive just with naked power. A doctrine and a mission is always required. That emerging powers such as China, Russia, Turkey, and the plethora of non-state actors are challenging a world order they had no part in drafting represents, in essence, the assertion of civilizational distinctions. The Western-inspired order of political correctness, the primacy of human rights and international rules of conduct over the Westphalian concept of national sovereignty are incompatible with the traditions of these new rising powers and the major civilizations that are now asserting their presence with particular virulence. Due to the evident exhaustion of Western universalism, Henry Kissinger's recipe in his latest book, World Order, of a return to the Westphalian system and the balance of power is anyway gaining ground by its own weight. The withdrawal of South Africa, Gambia, and Burundi from the International Court represents a mounting defiance of the Western-inspired international value system. Universal peace, I am afraid you would agree with me, is a dream for the fullness of time. Time and again, the attitude of Europe's statesmen in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars has been vindicated that the optimal objective of statesmanship is not universal peace, but as prolonged as possible periods of stability. May we at least be blessed with leaders that would not start war on the spur of anger, nor fight a battle out of spite. Back to my country for a last comment. Israel's tacit alliance with the region's Sunni powers is a circumstantial marriage of convenience, aimed essentially at stemming the rise and expansion of a Shiite Iranian empire and facing the challenge of Islamist terrorism to the incumbent conservative Arab regimes. The genie of democracy in the Arab world has only temporarily and repressively pushed back into the bottle. The betrayal of Palestine by the Arab states is bound to be a short-lived affair. Indeed, Netanyahu's boastful allusions to his Arab alliances notwithstanding, Israel's status in Riyadh and Cairo is that of a concubine one is not allowed to be accompanied with to the international soiree, precisely because of the illegitimacy of such an affair in the eyes of the Arab masses. Palestine is then bound to remain the ultimate common cause for the Arab peoples. The chances of true reconciliation with the Arab world passes through a change of mind and policies in Ramallah and Jerusalem. Being saturated with history, as the Israelis are, does not require becoming the hostage of history. The territorial answer to the Jewish atavistic fear, Israel was for too long unable to break the walls of its Jewish heritage. Her agonizing challenge today is to conduct a radical change of strategy by superseding the traditional tendency of its policymakers to take or avoid decisions only on the basis of worst-case scenarios. Israel could never really decide if she is an intimidating regional superpower or just an isolated Jewish ghetto waiting for the imminent pogrom to come. The same tools of democratic and utopian reason that allow the Zionist movement to recover the birthright of the Jewish nation and endowed her with a key to the future need to be put at the service of these most vital task of our times, bringing an end to the plight of the Palestinians. For we as a people have not survived all the horrors of extermination only to entrench ourselves, righteous and immobile, behind the walls of our own convictions, devising a solution to what for too long looked as an insoluble conundrum, that of making Jewish statehood a legitimate reality in the eyes of its victims, would seal our peace, I believe, with our own moral history. Thank you.
Thank you for that extraordinary discussion of the Middle East and other regions as well. The floor is open for comments, questions. There's a microphone here that you can come and talk into so we can record. If you do have a question, please state your name and affiliation, and then try to keep your question short so we can make our answers long. Yes.
Hello, thank you very much for this eulogy to realism. My name is Vasilis, an Onassis scholar at the European Institute at Columbia. You mentioned that Israel and middle powers should not defy great powers, and now we're undergoing a hegemonic transition from the Atlantic to the Pacific with the rise of China. So how should Israel balance its interest in the Middle East between the United States and China, given that the US, because of energy independence, is stepping out a little bit, is diversifying its areas of interest from the Middle East and the Mediterranean to the Pacific? Thank you. And if I may have a quick second question, a comment on the triangles between Israel, Greece, and Cyprus, and how the energy environment in the region could affect Israel's security. Thank you.
Shall we have more?
It's up to you.
I think it's better to have all the questions.
So we'll take some more questions, and then other questions? Comments? Yes.
I'm sorry I came late, but did you mention sulha? I have yet to hear
Mention what?
Maybe the
Sulha, which is a tried and true modality in the Arab world.
sulha.
Right, sulha.
Okay. I did mention the word sulha. Yes.
Well,
You mentioned it. Yes, of course.
You're talking about third parties.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, other than William Quant, I've never heard anybody speak about utilizing the modality of sulha. Could you speak to that?
Okay.
Yes. Why don't you come up to the microphone?
Hi, my name is Balan Stribling. I'm a recent grad from Columbia in the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program. And you talked a lot about ripeness in the Arab and Israeli conflict. How would you determine the conditions of ripeness? And if they do not exist, how do you mitigate the risk of reaching an impasse in the negotiation or the mediation within the conflict?
So the question is, you talk about the concept of ripeness for
Ripeness.
right, and the question is, how would you assess the situation now and the risks? Did I get that right?
How would you determine the conditions of ripeness?
Aha. So we have several questions. Would you like to
Yes.
take a stab at them?
Well, I don't think that Israel's options are between the U.S. and China. I think that China plays more within its own orbit. She is not particularly active in the politics of the Middle East. She's active in buying assets, even in a country like Israel, high tech and food industries. So this is not, an option between China. There is presumably, and also historically, there has always been an option between Russia, the Soviet Union, and Israel. More than the product of Western imperialism, as the propaganda goes, Israel is the product of Soviet communism. It fought its 1948 war with Czech weapons and with the support of the Soviet Union. And there was always a trend in Israel of having special relations with Russia. Sharon later tried it. Now we have a defense minister who is of Russian origin, and he has this proclivity towards Russia. But it is not a real choice, frankly. I don't think that Israel has such an option. Russia has become an important player in the politics of the Middle East. Israelis are coordinating the limits, the boundaries of military intervention in Syria, and there is a good rapport with Putin. But I don't think that this is the beginning of a long-term alliance. Israel is under no condition to waive the assets and the friendship that the United States can offer. I think this is more of an academic thinking rather than a realistic possibility. But again, Russia is playing a game that trying to fill a void that was created by the US, and parties are trying to accommodate themselves with Russia, and Israel is the same. And the understanding over Syria is in the benefit of both parties, so they do not encroach on each other's spaces. So that's basically what it is, I think. It's an extremely interesting question, the one about Cyprus, Israel, and Greece. First, it has to do with the rivalry between Greece and Turkey. When Israel was alienated from the Turks, it became important both for Cyprus and for Greece. And then Israel became a sort of regional energetic power. Israel has gas now. And that was extremely important for the Turks and for the Greek as well. As a matter of fact, the reconciliation between Israel and Turkey that happened lately was not particularly welcomed by the Russians. precisely because of the question of gas. They still have these projects of gas to Europe through Turkey. But eventually they accepted that, and a government in Athens of Tsipras, the Syriza party, that is the most anti-Israel that you can imagine. That's, again, Sharon used to say that always, that what you see from there, you don't see from here. I mean, what you see from when you are not in office, you don't see when you are in office. This guy, Tsipras, has gone to Israel in 6 months 3 times, accompanied by 6 ministers, signed a number of agreements, and became, in the European Union, one of the best friends of Israel. Again, this has to do with looking for a balance with Turkey and the gas strategy, energy strategy. The question of ripeness is extremely important, extremely interesting, and I always use it, although it is a very elusive sort of term, you might agree, because there is nothing scientific about what is right, when a conflict is ripe for solution. I think that the Israeli-Palestine conflict is overripe if you take into consideration so many years and so many attempts at reaching an agreement. According to the current leaders of Israel, the fact that the key Sunni powers in the region have shifted from the question of Palestine to more immediate concerns, such as the survival of the regimes, Islamist terrorism, and Iran, he believes, Netanyahu does believe that this is the moment for a deal on Israel's conditions. So I'm afraid this won't happen, because when you say Israel's condition, it depends what Israel. If Israel's conditions is Netanyahu conditions, I have my doubts if these can produce an agreement with the Palestinians. When we came back from the summit with the president and Mr. Arafat, etc., I got my own conclusion. My own conclusion is that this is not a question that the United States can solve because of its domestic constraints, because of the sense in the Arab world, and particularly among the Palestinians, that this is an unbalanced attitude by the American administration. And therefore, I think that the idea that I advanced already then, years ago, I have an article I wrote in 2001 in Newsweek, where I say that there is a need for a change of paradigm in the Israel-Palestine dispute. You need not to internationalize the conflict, you need to internationalize the solution. If the Iran deal requires 5P+1 and dealing with North Korea, the 6 nations, why not have this kind of consortium of nations around agreed principles? And if the United States is part of that body, of this international body, this should serve as a guarantee for a reasonable Israeli government that its basic interest would be safeguarded in Israel-Palestine dealing with this consortium.
Thank you. Other questions? Oh, there was a question about Surha?
About?
The Arab notion of...
Sorry. Yeah. Well, there are the thing of Sulha is it was used more than once in the public discourse. I'm not aware that it was used in talks between official parties. This is a term that presumably means that we get reconciliation, we turn the page. But as far as I was told, as I was instructed by people that know about it, this does not necessarily mean a permanent peace. This is sort of interim sort of agreement. I guess that Hamas would be happy to have this kind of sulha if the conditions are ripe for it. You see, the odd thing about this is that there is much of a common denominator between Israel and Hamas on this, than between Israel and the PLO, for the following reason. Both Israel and the PLO want a final settlement, only that Israel is incapable of paying the price that they want, and they are in no mood to go for an interim solution, whereas a final settlement is totally alien to the philosophy of Hamas. They are for an interim kind of settlement. Therefore, sulha is something that can probably work with Hamas, not necessarily with the PLO.
Yes, in the back.
Hi, thank you for your candid and critical talk.
If you take the
Come to the
microphone,
mic. There's a microphone up here, way up here. Sorry.
Okay. My question is, if you could, you talked about the failure of Arab states. I'm also concerned with the failure of the United Nations, or failures. So you can pick whichever you choose, but if you could create a laundry list or like an ingredients of what you think should be required from either one, and then the method for which they would go about executing in each area to create or begin to create peace in Palestine and Israel, how would you have that be played out?
You know, tons of money were invested by the European Union and other well-wishers in projects of so-called people-to-people, you know, bring Israelis and Palestinians closer to each other, create trust between them. And this will inevitably, people think, and incrementally produce perhaps an agreement. I don't agree that. I don't accept that. I think it is an illusion. Trust is not important. What is important is respect. Rabin never saw the face of Hafez al-Assad of Syria, yet he promised him a total withdrawal from the Golan Heights without even seeing him. What kind of trust was there? Nothing. What kind of trust did de Gaulle build with the Algerians before he withdrew from Algeria? What kind of trust did we build with Sadat when he suddenly one day came to Jerusalem? The question is respect. We do not respect. That's the question. There is a lack of seeing the other side as equal to you with it, and with equal needs. And this goes for both parties in some of the aspects of the process. So building trust between the occupied and the occupier is impossible. And it is the major fallacy of Oslo, that you let us build gradually trust. It won't work. So I think that we need to separate between peace and the building of trust and reconciliation and economic cooperation. That was one of the major things where I totally disagreed with the late Shimon Peres. We only gave back Gaza, and he was already dreaming about a European Union of the Middle East. The Arabs want development, want technology, but they don't want it from the Israelis. This will take generations. It was a professor in this university, Edward Said, who said that Israel is the measure of the failure of the Arab world. So how would they accept technology from Israel? I remember a visit I made to Amman, invited by Prince Hassan, the brother of King Hussein. I came with the author Amos Oz, and we were traveling in Amman, and we passed through a very sophisticated medical center, and he told me, the prince, tell Mr. Shimon Peres that we also have one or two assets in high technology. So they would not accept that. I think that peace was the essential parameters of such a peace agreement were put forward, in my modest opinion, by President Clinton. It might not be perfect. There is no such a thing as a perfect agreement. It is the relative imperfectness of an agreement that can make it into an agreement that the parties can accept. And striving always for another kvetch here and another kvetch there will not make an agreement. So I think that President Clinton drew a brilliant line of equilibrium between the positions of Israelis and Palestinians as they stood at the end of a very long process, not in Camp David, later on. It says practical withdrawal from the entire West Bank and Gaza. It spoke about dismantling 101 settlements, practically no settlements remaining in the heartland of Palestine. It spoke about swaps. It spoke about return of Palestinians on the basis of a humanitarian reunification of families. It spoke about a multilateral force to be deployed along the Jordan River. I mean, you can say, of course, and then he spoke about the division of Jerusalem, about the partition of Jerusalem, with a recognition of the holy sites of the Palestinians, of the Arab world, and of ours. May I tell a personal anecdote?
Yes, please do.
You can find it in the book of Martin Indyk, so it's not something I'm inventing for this occasion. The Martin Indyk's book, Innocent Abroad, it's taken from you know whom.
Mark Twain. Mark
Who
Twain.
knows from where?
Is it Mark Twain?
Mark Twain. Innocent Abroad, American Policy in the Middle East. I personally came to Mr. Arafat at the very last moments. Now you might understand UNESCO, in the last moments of the negotiations, and I proposed to him the following. I told him, we, the Israeli side, he was always a very religious man, Arafat, we accept total and unconditional sovereignty on the Temple Mount, or what the Muslims call the Haram al-Sharif, okay? But only one condition. Since you always said that if you get sovereignty, you are not going to excavate you are not going to conduct archaeological excavations, the only thing that we demand is that in the peace treaty, you will spell out why you don't excavate. Say that you do not excavate because there is a holy shrine of the Jews somewhere there. This would give political satisfaction because we are going to conduct a sellout of a holy shrine. He said, no, there is nothing there. I'm not going to accept that. There is no way I would accept that. And here you have a case where his incapacity to accept that this is a holy site also for you, although you are not going to make any use out of it because it is deep in the mountain and it is only symbolic. For him, it was a make or break. He would not accept that. If you look at the non-official Geneva peace agreement, I don't know if some of you are familiar with it. It is a group of Israelis and Palestinians that signed the peace agreement just to show to the politicians that this is possible. This idea of mine appears there. They endorsed it. But then, this is in lab conditions. This is not in real life. It's a pity.
Shlomo, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. It's a wonderful evening.